if there was a linkage in that the money that they had stolen going to terrorism, then that is a failure of the FBI and our court system in not figuring that out and basically charging them.
But what you're seeing here is you're seeing a weaponization. We'll continue to fix it. They're going to continue to come up with numbers that don't have it there, and it's sensationalized. I don't expect anything different from this administration. The vile racist lies and slander towards our fellow Minnesotans. Donald Trump's calling our Somali neighbors garbage and the state of Minnesota a hellhole is, I'm assuming, is unprecedented for a United States president.
The media would have you believe this is just another case of exaggerated outrage from the right. They want you to think Minnesota's massive fraud scandal is overblown, misunderstood, or somehow conveniently linked back to Donald Trump. Because when Democrats fail, accountability is never the first instinct. Deflection is. Someone else has to be blamed. Even if the logic makes no sense, there's an old rule in politics. Falsehoods move fast, while the truth is still getting ready to leave the house. And that's exactly what's happening here. So slow down, stay focused, and stick with me until the end. Because once you strip away the headlines and talking points, the facts hit much harder than the spin to here's the unvarnished reality. Under Governor Tim Walz, Minnesota became the center of one of the largest welfare fraud scandals in U.S. history. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a misunderstanding. We're talking about billions of dollars siphoned away while oversight collapsed. And like it or not, Ilhan Omar's political circle sits uncomfortably close to the fallout. Instead of clear explanations or serious accountability, what do we get? Lectures, finger-wagging, and somehow, once again, Donald Trump is cast as the villain. At this point, if a pothole opens up in Minneapolis, don't be surprised if someone blames Mar-a-Lago. That's how detached the narrative has become. Let's walk through what actually happened, not what cable news wants you to feel about it. Because the paper trail isn't vague. The numbers aren't debatable. And no amount of narrative management can erase $1 billion once it's gone. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about competence, oversight, and whether anyone in power is willing to admit what went wrong. And that's the part they're hoping you won't look too closely at.
Let me amend it. Equally bad part. You say, well, hello, how could this happen? Why didn't the people in the Department of Social Services and the Welfare Department in state government, when they saw these claims arising, why didn't they say something? Didn't they go out and check these businesses that were supposedly sites to feed homeless children? Didn't they go talk to some of the children and their parents to see if some of the children really were autistic? Didn't the state authorities go out and say, can you show us one of the homes that you're providing to the homeless people? After all, we're spending $1 billion. They didn't, because the politicians wouldn't let them. And the crooks who were setting all this up, they're pretty smart. I'll give you one example. Remember I talked about the nonprofit involved in feeding the so-called hungry children, called Feeding the Future? The rank and file employees in the welfare office started getting suspicious when the claims went up, and they contacted Feeding Our Future. And they said, hey, what's going on here? You know, we're going to start cutting off these claims because it's getting a little bit expensive. And you know what Feeding Our Future did? They threatened the employees. They said, if you cut off our money, they sent them an email, and they did it by phone. They told the state agency that failing to promptly approve new applicants from minority-owned businesses would result in a lawsuit, feeding accusations of racism that would be scrawled across the news. Feeding Our Futures went to the state and said, if you stop giving us this money, we're going to call you racist and we're going to sue you, and you don't want to be in the news. Now, here's what, and you say, well, why didn't the employees do something? They did. They told the people higher up, the people with the flags in their office. And you know what they did? Nothing. You know why? Well, here's what the legislative auditor in Minnesota said. He said that the threat of litigation and the negative press affected how the state politicians use their regulatory power. And here's what a fraud investigator in the Attorney General's office said. She said, there is a perception that, I'm quoting now, that forcefully tackling this issue would cause political backlash from the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats. And in fact, one of the other witnesses in the fraud investigation said, look, I told the prosecutors, let me just give you a cold dish of truth. The 80,000 voting bloc of folks with Somali ancestry, you got to have their votes to win in Minneapolis. And if you're a Democrat, you can't win Minneapolis, you can't win in state. So the politicians did nothing. Don't just take my word for it. And don't blame the state employees. They tried. In fact, recently the state employees, they just said, look, we've had enough. They posted this. These are over several hundred employees from the Minnesota Department of Human Service who administer this program, who just get up every day and go to work and do their job and want to help people. This is what they posted on social media. I'm quoting now, Mr. President. Governor Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, because this fraud was an open secret. But I'm quoting from what the employee said. Governor Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on. That's the employees talking. Hoping for a partnership and stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers, using monitoring, using threats, using repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. Instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz and an indifferent mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can return to. And now there are reports coming out, Mr. President. I don't know if they're true, but I know the prosecutors are desperately trying to get the bottom of it. And I don't want to say that this is true, but a report came out in a publication called City Journal, which is published by the Manhattan Institute. And they are alleging that money, part of this $1 billion that was stolen, they are alleging that at least a portion of it went to a terrorist organization in Somalia that we've all heard of. It's notorious. It's an organization called Al-Shabaab. They hate Americans. They're terrorists. They want to kill Americans and drink their blood out of a boot. They were taking a cut, according to this claim. Again, I don't know if it's true, but the prosecutors are trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, there's been a lot of allegations about racism in these reports. They're saying, oh, you're just picking on the Somali community. I'm not. And I don't think the American people are. I think what they're picking on are crooks. They're picking on crooks. Well, everything I just gave you are facts, Mr. President. It has nothing to do with race. But it is a fact that these $1 billion schemes were cooked up by leaders in the Somali community in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. And it is a fact that most of the businesses that participated in this fraud and this thievery were run by people of Somali ancestry. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad. That's just a fact. And I don't think we ought not to talk about it. And it is a fact that the kickbacks paid to parents to allow their children to be signed up as autistic, in order to get the federal taxpayer money, the parents were of Somali ancestry. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that, but it is a fact. And it is a fact that the politicians, not the employees, the rank and file employees and the welfare offices, but the politicians in Minnesota let this happen. It is disgusting, Mr. President. Disgusting. We're trying to put together a budget right now. And we've got state officials in Minnesota, because they wanted votes, that are allowing people in their state who are crooks to steal $1 billion from the American taxpayer. Money that could have gone to people who really were homeless, and children who really were hungry, and kids who through no fault of their own really were autistic, instead of stolen, a portion of which allegedly was sent to a terrorist organization in Somalia. Man, these people ought to all be put in jail, including the politicians. Makes me want to stick my head in an oven.
Let's take the emotion out of this entirely and deal with what actually matters. Facts, timelines, money, and responsibility. What happened in Minnesota was not a clerical mistake. It was not confusion. It was not an unfortunate oversight. Under Governor Tim Walz, the state presided over one of the largest welfare fraud scandals in American history. More than $1 billion didn't simply disappear. It was taken, systematically, repeatedly, and for years. Federal prosecutors later uncovered multiple large-scale fraud operations running in plain sight. These weren't small-time schemes. They were organized pipelines that exploited programs designed to help the most vulnerable. One involved fake child nutrition programs. Another revolved around non-existent housing services for the homeless. The most disturbing of all involved fraudulent claims tied to autistic children. Start with the child feeding programs. On paper, they looked compassionate and urgent. Organizations claimed they were serving meals to thousands of children. In reality, many of those meals were never served. Instead, taxpayer money was rerouted into luxury lifestyles, expensive homes, high-end jewelry, lavish travel, even yachts. The children these programs were meant to help received nothing. Then came the housing scheme. Certain nonprofits claimed they were providing shelter for homeless individuals. Funding skyrocketed from modest amounts into budgets exceeding $100 million a year. Yet investigators couldn't verify the existence of actual housing tied to the spending. No addresses, no facilities, no proof, just money flowing out and disappearing. And then there was the most alarming case. Children were falsely classified as autistic to unlock massive federal and state funding. Parents were allegedly incentivized to participate. Taxpayers were billed hundreds of millions of dollars for care and services that never took place. That isn't advocacy. That isn't inclusion. That is exploitation at its worst. This is where the story shifts from criminal behavior to political failure. State employees didn't miss this. Auditors flagged it early. Investigators raised concerns. Internal warnings were issued long before federal prosecutors stepped in. But instead of action, those warnings were sidelined. According to sworn testimony, officials were pressured to back off after nonprofits threatened accusations of racism and legal retaliation if funding was questioned. Oversight didn't collapse by accident. It was abandoned. Investigators later stated that leadership feared political backlash more than financial loss. Protecting taxpayer dollars took a backseat to protecting relationships with influential voting blocs. That decision allowed the fraud to continue unchecked. Eventually, hundreds of employees from Minnesota's Department of Human Services came forward publicly. They stated that Governor Walz had been warned early, failed to act, and that whistleblowers faced retaliation. That's not responsible leadership. That's institutional failure. And yet, when the scandal became impossible to ignore, accountability never followed. Instead, we saw deflection, silence from major media outlets, and somehow, predictably, Donald Trump was blamed, which is remarkable considering Trump wasn't governor, didn't oversee the agencies, didn't authorize the spending, and didn't suppress the investigators. Still, he was cast as the villain. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar's political network sits uncomfortably close to the center of this controversy. Not because of identity, not because of race, but because of proximity, influence, and jurisdiction. Facts don't become hateful just because they're inconvenient. Fraud doesn't turn into compassion when it hides behind moral language. This money was meant to feed hungry children, shelter homeless families, and support disabled kids. Instead, it fueled corruption. And investigators are now examining whether portions of those funds may have ended up connected to foreign extremist networks. That's not a partisan issue. That's a moral one. That the real scandal isn't that this fraud occurred. It's that when alarms were sounding, the people in charge chose politics over the public. That's the story that gets buried. That's why the conversation keeps getting redirected. And that's why you're hearing everything except the truth.